Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's cybersecurity webinar. My name is Margaret Fahey, and I'm the External Relations Manager at the French American Foundation, United States. Today, we are honored to welcome Chris Inglis, former United States National Cyber Director, and our moderator, Dr. Cara LaPointe, Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University and 2016 French American Foundation Young Leader, for a conversation on critical cybersecurity challenges. We're so appreciative of you joining us today to share your expertise. The Foundation's Cybersecurity Webinar Series is designed to complement our annual two-day cybersecurity conference in Washington, D.C. Now in its 11th year, the conference will take place on December 9th and 10th, 2024, and we hope you'll save these dates and consider joining us this year. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you that our Q&A is open and you can submit your questions throughout the event. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Foundation's YouTube channel. I will now hand the program over to our moderator, Dr. Cara LaPointe. Thank you.
Margaret, thank you so much, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm super excited to be here with Mr. Chris Inglis, who has over 40 years of service in national security and cybersecurity. He's had a distinguished record in the U.S. Air Force. He was at the National Security Agency, and he was the first National Cyber Director for the United States, among many other roles. He truly is a global expert in this domain. So Chris, let's start off today's conversation by really level setting on the state of the digital world today. How would you describe the opportunities and challenges that we have in our increasingly digital dependence?
Well, first, thank you, Margaret and Cara, for the opportunity to have this discussion. I think increasingly, if I were to say the state of the digital world, it's one that's shared across national boundaries. And so this is a really important venue to have this discussion. But I'll just give you a few kind of perhaps off the top of mind thoughts about the state of the digital world. One, no surprise, we're all more dependent upon it than we ever were before. And it's been to some degree insidious, meaning it happens slowly. I'm not sure that everybody realizes the dependence we have for our personal lives or business lives, the management of supply chains, or even national security. And it has been true since the dawn of the internet, almost 50 years ago now. Technology is the very visible thing. We all know what version of an iPhone we have, or a Galaxy phone, or the kind of newest and novel technology. But it's really about getting the technology right, the doctrine right. That's a fancy word for the assignment of roles and responsibilities, and making sure that people are prepared to take full advantage of cyberspace. Threats are up in this space. That's no great surprise. The cost of entry is still very low. The lucrative assets that might be acquired by criminals and nation states is still very attractive, very high. And we increasingly see syndication, meaning that threat actors, particularly in the criminal realm, threat actors now combine their efforts. There might be a threat actor that's good at cracking through a firewall, and another one that's good at assessing what value might be behind that firewall, and yet another one that's good at kind of reaching out, engaging a prospective victim and negotiating a ransom with them. And they now have met each other in cyberspace. They combine their efforts in cyberspace when they've never actually physically met each other in the real world. That syndication is troubling. I think our response, therefore, must take that into account. We'll probably talk about that throughout this session. I think summarizing all of that, what we see across the last 50 years is an ever-present contest between innovation, market efficiency, and safety. Now, there are any number of words for safety. Security might stand in for that word, or resilience. But those are the three legs that I think we need under the stool of digital infrastructure. Unfortunately, most of the last 50 years has been kind of driven by innovation and market efficiency. That's the exciting wild ride we've been on. And safety has always been the third poor stepchild that has been left out in the cold. I think what you now see is a growing realization that has been a challenge, that's been a problem. And so when you see governments beginning to stand in to regulate this space, they're trying to put that third leg under the stool. You now see companies, large companies, who might not have before thought they were in the cybersecurity game, saying that we think we have some accountability for inherent resilience in this digital infrastructure, or the functions on top of it. And you certainly see entities like the Securities Exchange Commission within the United States imposing a responsibility on those companies. So I think the future for us is realizing all of that. How do we get not just the technology right, but the doctrine right? How do we get the skills right so that we can actually make cyberspace meet our expectations? I'd summarize by saying I don't think that we should elevate cyber as priority. we should subordinate it to the things we already care about, whether it's banking online, whether it's social media, the conduct of an election. We'll probably talk a little bit about that, or national security purposes. We need to understand that those are the things that gives priority to the things upon which they depend. Digital infrastructure is certainly one of those.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think you teed up a lot of different conversations that we'd like to dive into. So let's talk a little bit about regulation in particular, right? You know, this is generally an audience where we have folks from government and from industry and from academia in the audience. And so there's a lot of different perspectives on regulation and the importance of it. Can you talk about how you see regulation and its role in really creating cyber resilience and cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I think I would start with other systems of interest that we all have some experience with. Let me talk about automobile transportation. There are any number of examples, but that's the one that perhaps is in common across not just state boundaries within the United States, but national boundaries. And when you think about how safety comes into being for someone who drives a car from point A to point B, there are many elements, and they're all applied concurrently. Let me walk through some of them. First, let's talk about the device, the car, right? There are built-in safety features, whether it's a safety belt or an air safety bag or a seat belt. Anti-lock brakes are now going to be standard on US cars. Somebody has thought about what the properties of the car must be and actually assigned responsibility for a mix of regulation and incentives to the manufacturer so that they build those in. But it's not just about the device, it's also about the systems within which they operate. So the road systems have standards in terms of what's the width, what's the quality of the surface, what's the signage, what's the height of the bridge. All of that has been addressed so that within the kind of the system that the car operates, we have some confidence that that actually has been built so that that might be safe. And then finally, there's the governance of the operation of those systems. We hold the kind of the builders of cars and the builders of roads accountable for performing that as they build, deploy, and sustain those. We also hold the operators, the car operators, right, accountable for sustaining that kind of those safety features. In the United States, we say, put your hands at the 10 and 2 o'clock position. Don't drink while you drive. Don't text while you drive. Don't speed. And if you do all of those things, then you have some reasonable confidence you can get from place A to place B. There is some degree of self-enlightenment involved in that, meaning that there are parties that say, I'm going to do it just because it's the right thing to do. There are market forces involved in that, where one company competes against another. But at the end of the day, we learned in that system that there are things that are not discretionary that must be done, no matter how much market forces may deliver those. We can't leave that to chance. And so we've stepped in to say that we're going to ensure that that's done. We have regulated the use of seatbelts. We have regulated driver's training. We have regulated those things that we think cannot be left to discretion. And I think our experience would show that market forces almost always go to a bubble. They almost always find a moment where that bubble collapses, and whether it's safety that then hangs in the balance, or perhaps kind of the viability of a marketplace hangs in the balance, that the market forces alone didn't deliver what's needed. This is why regulation is beginning to stand into this space, because I think you can take all of those analogs that I described in the automobile system and bring that into cyberspace. We need to make sure that the devices are built with some degree of safety in mind. We need to make sure that the systems within which they operate are built with some degree of safety in mind. We need to make sure that operators, whether they're those folks that build and deploy commodity services like the cloud, or those folks that use it at the end of a supply chain, that they sustain that security. And to some degree, that's not discretionary. But to get regulation right in cyberspace, and it was kind of introduced in the 2023 National Cybersecurity Strategy for the United States, first time in 5 iterations of that strategy, dating back over 25 years. To get that right, we have to make sure that the government takes a high degree of consultation from the private sector so that it doesn't regulate the wrong things in pursuit of a good goal, a noble goal. It needs to make sure that in regulating, it does some degree of deconfliction. In the United States, we have the states can regulate. We have various non-public entities like the SEC that effectively regulate. And then we have federal agencies, which are not by any means monolithic. If they all regulated without some degree of coordination, we would smother this poor child in its crib. And so we need to make sure that we harmonize those regulations. And then finally, we need to always remember the humility that should be exercised by regulators, which is we should regulate only when necessary and with the lightest possible touch. No lighter, but when necessary with the lightest possible touch. Now, what I've left out is the international component, which is to regulate across national boundaries with a sense as to what the common aspirations might be. And so the EU and national entities stand in as a very important component of what the United States must consider so that it gets it right. I know I've gone a little bit long on this question. It is complicated. We've got a long kind of amount of doctrinal debt to pay back. Probably should have been doing this 40, 50 years ago at the dawn of the internet. So it's not something we're going to turn around in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And especially when you talk about, we should have been doing this a long time ago and we haven't. So now we need to go in more aggressively and figure out what the right regulation is, although with a light touch. So what have you seen that works really well and hasn't worked well in that getting the industry on board with understanding the importance of this on the regulation side?
Yeah, so let me take the national cybersecurity strategy in the United States in 2023. And for this, which I assume everyone in this audience is an international audience, whether you live in the United States, France, or someplace in between. It was a national strategy that was intended to be exercised or executed in an international domain. That's why the fifth of those kind of 5 pillars that were described in there was all about international collaboration. But having said that, in terms of how this is playing out, we have at the moment any number of entities that are attempting to stand in and regulate this space. Unfortunately, they tend to do what they know how to do. And what we've known how to do for the last 40, 50 years is to regulate the operators, people who live at the end of a supply chain. So we put our thumb on the scale for those poor souls who kind of inherit or who receive devices or systems that have not been designed with resilience in mind. They go toe to toe with very capable attackers, whether they're criminals or nation states, and find themselves unable to succeed, and which on occasion then kind of brings to bear this problem of we put our thumb on the scale of the operators who haven't got stuff that can be defended. We've held them accountable for not succeeding and going toe to toe with adversaries that are much more capable than they are. And so it's an unfair burden for them to bear, which is why we need to push this broadly across the entire ecosystem. If you build and deploy commodity software, there should be an expectation that you're going to make a contribution to its inherent safety. If you operate kind of broad swaths of commodity infrastructure like the cloud, there should be an expectation that you're going to actually make certain investments so that if you buy a pound of the cloud, I know we don't buy or sell it that way, but if you buy a pound of the cloud, safety comes along for the ride. So I think we'll find in the near term that we're actually focused on the wrong end of the problem, the operations end of it. We will over time push that consideration broadly across the entire ecosystem so that every party can do their part, right? So that each of us can contribute to the defense of all of us. But unfortunately, it'll take some iterations to get that right in the moment.
Yes, that's interesting, especially going back to your car analogy and transportation system analogy, right? Where there are responsibilities by government on the regulation side, the actual companies that are providing the products, and then the individuals to even maintain those, right? It's fascinating. How have you seen in the company piece of this, have you seen where that there's been uptake and realization that the products need to be more effective? I know, we have this history, especially on the software side, of beta testing, right? Let's crowdsource beta testing. And so, obviously some systems and some software may be safety critical and some may not. And do you see that we sometimes don't treat those in different buckets when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, what I'm going to say sounds very simple, perhaps simple-minded, but I think it's important. Understanding needs to lead strategy, and strategy needs to lead execution. And I don't know that we've got those in the right order. There are many companies and individuals who don't understand what their dependence on digital infrastructure might be. Give me just a second, I'll take care of that. Sorry, I live in cyberspace with multiple connections, so hopefully we'll be able to turn that off. Anyway, there are many individuals, companies, even nations who don't understand what their dependence on digital infrastructure is. And because they really don't know what the priority of this should be. And they then further don't know what the points of influence, what should they touch? What should they affect? What are the nouns in cyberspace? What are the verbs in cyberspace that then motivate their actions? Because we can't defend ourselves against all perils. So understanding needs to lead the parade. Having said that, we then need to have a strategy. So what do we do about that? And I think the strategy that's emerging within the United States, I think in France as well, is one that says we need to actually invest in some resilience by design, safety by design, maybe robustness by design, pick your term of art, but let's build that in as opposed to having a completely reactive strategy. Understanding that when we do that, the best we're going to be able to do is to make it defensible, but not secure. We need to then actually apply the human component to actually defend the space. And in actually defending that space, rely upon every participant in this ecosystem, the builders, the providers, the final goods assemblers, the sustainers, the operators, the users. All of us have a responsibility. That really is the emerging strategy, which then gets you to the third part of how do you allocate those roles and responsibilities and begin to execute. That's what the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy attempted to do. And to your earlier question about how do you have the temerity to put the word regulation in that, you have to do that based upon advice and consultation with those who would be regulated, right? So early in that process, we engaged through organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, through the consolidators who represent various sectors within the U.S. private sector, and our government, kind of our allies, right? Kind of national entities within France, within the United Kingdom, within Japan. How do we get this right? What should we regulate? With what degree of the right touch? What shouldn't we regulate? Where should market forces stand in? If you do that consultation up front, then you kind of imbue everybody with a certain degree of understanding about what you're trying to get done. B, you come up with a strategy that everyone can support and they know what their role in that might be. And C, you get it with the right touch. Now, we're not perfect in that. We'll probably overregulate some things and underregulate other things. But you have to go through that process. In the absence of strategy, nothing can be strategic. And so you got to get that part up front.
And have you seen real differences between the U.S. approach to developing these strategies and, say, European approaches or other areas of the world?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Europe is challenging from a United States perspective. I think they're in the right place with respect to what their intent is, but it's challenging from a United States perspective because you have the EU and then you have the national entities, sometimes looking like they're operating at cross purposes, when in fact they simply have different competencies, right? And that I think is a European term for who has responsibility for what. The EU classically has competence, right, for economic matters and the defense of kind of individual rights and privileges, what in the United States we would call individual liberties, where the nation states retain the responsibility and the competence for security. It is hard to align those. It is possible, but it is hard to align those. And therefore, from the United States perspective, we find ourselves sometimes trying to work our way through a reconciliation with the EU, sometimes a reconciliation with a nation state like France, but that's not easy to do. Now, having said that, I'm sure that my French friends would say the United States is not in any way, shape, or form coherent because you have the states, and then even within the federal government, various agencies and departments. And so I think that that would be a fair comment, maybe even a fair criticism of the United States. The challenge is, it goes back to the first point that I made about the issues that are in play here, is how do you align innovation, market efficiency, and safety? And how do you put an and between those three words as opposed to choosing one over the other? Because in order to make forward progress, we need innovation. There are problems yet to be solved that innovation will solve. We need to do that at scale. That's why market forces are so important. And in a free and open society like we enjoy across both France and the United States and a lot of places in between, that's an important life force to sustain. But three, we need to make sure that it's done safety or with some degree of efficacy in mind. To get those right, we need to work across the various governance constructs, the EU, France, the United States, and then the local entities within that, and realize that we all have allies that are on the margins of that. And that's not easy. But if we have some understanding about what our common aspirations are up front, if we have a strategy that says, here's broadly how we're going to actually imbue this digital infrastructure with our values and the forward progress we need, I think it's a solvable problem. We can, in fact, get this right.
So I like the optimism. That's fantastic. And let's talk right now about AI. Obviously, the intersection between AI and cybersecurity is complex, right? Because AI can be used for cybersecurity, it can be used for cyber attack. It also just its introduction into so many sectors and so many domains introduces new threat vectors, right? And it's a perfect example of when you're talking about kind of differences in terms of approach of regulation, right? Obviously, very different things from a transatlantic perspective. So how do you see the importance of AI when you're thinking about cybersecurity?
Yeah, so let's leave the regulation piece of that aside for a minute. I think we've covered that reasonably well. Questions can bring us back into that, but let me just talk about AI for its own sake. The first thing that's, I think, important to get about generative AI, that's the latest form of artificial intelligence, is the speed at which it arrived. You might be bedazzled, impressed by what it is in the moment, but I think the really interesting thing and the thing we need to consider and get our arms around is the speed at which it arrived and the speed at which it is changing even further. It arrived, boldly about 15 months ago. It surprised just about everyone, even I think its creators. But since then, we've seen about 4, possibly 5 iterations of generative AI. And so it's changing in the moment. If we were using an American analogy, a dog that a car just raced by, and we, like dogs do, chase that car and eventually catch it, it won't be a car when we catch it. It will have sufficiently changed. And so we need to think about how we adjust to the speed of it. If we were standing on a beach and we see a large wave approaching, you might try to hold your arms up, kind of stop the wave, get your arms around it, wrestle it to the ground. Of course, there's no sense to that. We need to turn around and figure out how do we ride that wave? How do we actually go with it? And to that point, I think that we have to have a value-based or a performance-based system as opposed to a checklist in the moment that addresses the current instantiation of generative AI. And those values, I think, to all of us on this session probably look something like this. One, we need to kind of recognize that if we're going to make use of this technology, and I'm ultimately going to argue that we must, but if we're going to make use of this technology, we need to understand for what purposes we would apply it. We need to understand how we're going to build it so that we can use it for those purposes and constrain it to those purposes. We need to instrument it so we know what it's actually doing, and we need to have control so that we can bring it back into alignment when it perhaps exceeds our expectations. Now, I know that some will quickly observe correctly that even the creators don't know exactly what's happening inside these systems. I frankly don't have any idea what's happening under the hood of my car. It's got 50 million lines of software in it, but that doesn't matter because I have instrumentation that tells me what it's doing in the moment. I have controls that allow me to control its speed or to bring it back into my expectations. So I think we need to lift and shift that prospect into this. That then kind of leads to the second point, which is that really is all about ensuring that the technology serves us as opposed to the other way around. I was an instructor pilot in the Air Force for a while, meaning I was happy once. I remember one of the favorite questions that I would ask a student who was at that point challenged was, are you flying the airplane or is it flying you? We just need to make sure that we remember that question when we use generative AI, right? Do we understand that its purpose is to support human aspirations? We may give it some semi-autonomous authorities. We may allow it to do things that a human can't do at speed, but it ultimately has to serve some human purpose. The human remains the accountable part. In that second piece, we need to then double down on what it means to be human. We need to make sure that we understand where accountability lies, where values lie. We're never going to hold a machine uniquely, solely accountable in a court of law for something that it did. There's always going to be a human being that's going to be the accountable party. Let's never forget that. And then having done that, we need to, again, still in that second piece, focused on the human, train humans about what AI can do, what its capabilities are. Give them critical thinking skills so that when they see some new implementation of that they are not flummoxed in that moment, confused in that moment, that they have the ability to say, I got it. I might not have anticipated this waking up this morning, but I know what I'm going to do because my values are strong. My accountability remains intact in me. This machine must serve me. This is what I'm going to do about that. We can't script that in advance. And I've seen situations where perhaps we've begun to see some weakness in the fabric of the connection between these machines and human beings. We can't let that happen. If we do those two things, then it leads to my third thing, which is we must use it. Your competitors are using it, whatever business you're in at the moment. Our adversaries have begun to use it, whether they're criminals or rogue nation states. And they are at the moment slightly ahead of us because they use this without the full consideration of how to use it properly. sometimes the wildness of a particular implementation is an advantage for an attacker. I think that we will catch up. We will ultimately prevail on the defense and the proper application of this technology, but it's going to take the work that I described in those first two buckets in order to get that right.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and especially when you talk about values-based AI, right? And you give the analogy between your car and really complex software and complex automation. The difference with AI is that machines are building the underlying models based on data. So our ability to infuse values in that same way is challenging. So do you think that maybe a proxy for that is outcomes-based regulation? Because I agree with you that the technology is moving so fast, you can't regulate the underlying technology itself. But I'm questioning about how well we can build values in versus measuring outcomes coming out.
I agree. So let me talk about that in two parts. One, let's talk about how we imbue these systems with values. There might be two ways to raise a generative AI machine, and I'm going to use an analogy that kind of like harkens back to how children are raised in open and civil societies. One is you just allow the machine to roam wild over large swaths of data, and essentially it trains itself. It consumes all the data, it tries to make sense of the data, it tries to come to some perhaps reconciliation of that so that it can then extrapolate, generate going forward. That, in my view, if we did that, absent some human intervention about what the values should be, would be, anybody familiar with the book Lord of the Flies, dropping a whole bunch of young children on an island and just saying, sort that out, figure it out going forward. You would get something that was not entirely predictable, probably chaotic, and maybe something that you would regret. So I think that the other alternative is the one that's preferred, which is how do we make sure that as we train these machines with large swaths of information, that there's a human in the loop of that, right? Not just in its execution, but in its formative moments. Much like parents at a dinner table, day after day after day, or parents involved in the life of a child, are not so much micromanaging the development of that child, but providing the sidewalls and an inject of values and kind of helping them understand that's a good choice, that's not a particularly good choice, and helping them reconcile not just to other children, but reconcile to society, reconcile to the responsibilities of society. So I think that is what I now see the kind of the path being. And the major companies are beginning to do just that, which is to keep humans in the loop of the development phase. Now, if you do that, once you say it's ready, I now have this model that I want to deploy, this technology I want to deploy. If I'm the regulator, and I'm not, but if I'm the regulator, I want to know the following. Like, what are the capabilities that kind of are in this? What is it authorized to do? What instrumentation have you provided so that somebody can actually see that's what it's doing? What are the sidewalls on this that require perhaps a further kind of consultation with a human being? What choices might it make that require human intervention? What choices have you allowed it to make that don't require human intervention because they're pretty straightforward? And what are the controls that you built in so that a human being might bring it back into alignment? Those must be performance-based kind of questions as opposed to a checklist, because these models will have very different compositions, very different purposes, and very different kind of implementations in terms of how they operate in the wild. So you need to have a performance-based. This is much like the NIST security model, for those of you familiar with the cybersecurity premise, which is let's just ask some basic kind of plain language questions. In the NIST model, the plain questions are, do you know what your dependencies on digital infrastructure are? Can you actually kind of prioritize those and then protect those to some degree? Can you detect when there's been perhaps an anomaly in that dependence? Can you respond to that? Can you recover from that? None of that specifies a particular implementation in the cybersecurity world. There's an analog, pun intended, there's an analog, I think, of those questions in the AI world. And so long as we remember that these machines are built and should be operated to support human beings, accountability remains with the human being, and that we need to have some transparency about what they're doing and ability to bring it back into alignment. I think that we'll be, there's a small word, kind of big hand, little map, I think we'll be fine. But it will be hard work to get it there. But I think that I'm bullishly optimistic about our ability to get this right.
Great, thanks for that. And so going back to this fundamental principle of understanding what your vulnerabilities are is very important, right? Yet we have seen time and time again the increase of ransomware attacks on individuals, ransomware attacks on organizations. Can you talk about that, about what is driving that and how we protect against that, both as organizations, government, and individuals?
Yeah, back to an earlier point in the conversation. So the cost of entry in terms of being a criminal or a rogue kind of nation state in this space, it's just too low. There's too much digital infrastructure that is not well designed, not well defended, that offers too many opportunities. So I think that for the foreseeable future, it's going to be impossible to completely rule out, the act of criminal actions or kind of the abuse of power by nation states in this space. And so that then opens the opportunity, because the lucrative assets you might acquire in this space are what actually draws criminal and rogue nation states. The sum of those two means that this is here to stay for the foreseeable future. I think what you've seen in ransomware over the last few years is that they have ravaged not just small businesses, but large kind of enterprises and occasionally nation states. Remember when the North Korean attack called WannaCry brought down the entirety of the United Kingdom's healthcare system for a period of days. That has actually drawn the collective attention of governments and companies and individuals. So there has been a sharper focus on that over the last 2 to 3 years. That has dispersed, right, most of these actors such that they don't operate with the degree of size, scope, and scale that they once did. But having been dispersed, they can still be effective because, again, the cost of entry is very low. One person can crack into your system. A few persons can kind of evaluate perhaps the proceeds they might acquire by holding that system at risk. It only takes one person to negotiate a ransomware with you to acquire the material. So it doesn't take much. So it's been addressed, but it's been dispersed, and it's still there. What I think then the response should be is to continue to kind of focus on resilience by design, meaning let's build security and safety into these systems so that these ransomware actors, whether they're diffused or whether they're kind of concentrated, have a much harder time, hopefully, ultimately, an impossible challenge to break into these systems. Two, let's be somewhat more kind of persistent. Let's be very vigorous about understanding how these systems are being used, our systems are being used, such that if something does happen, we get it at the earliest possible moment, we box it at the earliest possible moment, we evict it at the earliest possible moment. In many cases, the ransomware actor who's ultimately successful has been in your system for weeks to months, right? And that gives them an opportunity to essentially seize the initiative in locking down the things of value in your system, so that you actually gave it away to them because you were not minding the store, you were asleep at the switch. And then finally, given that they're still going to try to come at us, they might occasionally beat our resilient systems, they might occasionally beat our watchfulness. We need to be able to respond to this with all of the instruments of power at our disposal. Some of those are private sector, right? Meaning let's kind of understand what processes, life forces shouldn't be in our systems and simply push them out, remove them. Some of those, many of those are in the hands of governments, plural, whether that's kind of using criminal kind of indictments, prosecution, extradition, whether that's using diplomatic power operating across national boundaries, whether that's using financial sanctions or financial seizures to seize the ill-gotten goods of these ransomware actors, and occasionally kicking the legs out from underneath these ransomware actors by using cyber power to shut down these operations on net. This is, I think, going to be a belts and suspenders and Velcro and zipper and buttons moment where we bring all of these to bear. But if all we do is try to shoot our way out of this, if all we do is to wait and react and respond, we don't attend to the inherent resilience and robustness or the vigilance and the maintenance of these systems, we'll find that the advantage inevitably always goes to the adversary who can essentially dictate the time and the place that they come after us. If I were to give you kind of a one-sentence answer to this, I would say still challenging, but I think that the forces are mobilizing on the defender side, where ultimately we're going to make them, whether you're a single actor or a rogue nation state, we're going to make them beat all of us to beat one of us. That is the prospect I think we have to have going forward.
Do you think there are certain industries that recognize their vulnerability early, so moved into this transition of protection, say financial industry or other industries, and what lessons learned that they could share with some industries that have taken longer to recognize this issue?
There are. So the financial industry is the one that typically, and I would too, kind of is given kind of top marks, right? They're way out in front in understanding what their dependence on digital infrastructure is, understanding what risks there are to that digital infrastructure, and they're not just cyber risks. They're a risk in terms of a dependence on kind of electrical power. They're a risk dependent upon a concentration in a geographic area that might be subject to violent weather. But they understand what those risks are, because I think that business for hundreds, if not millennia, has understood that they live in a world full of risk. Now, it used to be a bank robber would walk into the lobby with a hood on and kind of wave a gun. That's a risk, and therefore they understand the nature of risk and how in their business they have to address that up front. And they're particularly good at addressing the digital infrastructure risk. And there are some tried and true ways we've known for decades about how you actually address the foundational aspects of cyber defense, whether that's the use of encryption to make something that somebody might steal useless to them because it's enciphered, whether that's the use of hardening your digital infrastructure so it's hard to crack in the first place, the use of two-factor authentication, meaning you need two ways to prove who you are, so that some other person might not be able to steal your hard-earned resources simply by producing your name and a password, and so on and so forth. They're in a good place. And they have the margins to do it, meaning they have the resources necessary to make the investment. I think it's well known, kind of certainly within the United States, that JP Morgan spends upwards of $750 million on cybersecurity, not IT, but cybersecurity every year. Now, the challenge is that most of the other sectors of interest, healthcare comes to mind, energy comes to mind, but the United States defines those as 16 distinct critical sectors, each of which delivers a critical function dependent or that essentially delivers health, safety, or economic vitality. They don't have the margins, and sometimes they don't have the understanding, because they grew up in a world where risk could be held at arm's length by virtue of a fence, or there was simply no actor that was trying to hold that at risk. Consider kind of for a moment the pipeline sector. In the United States, we had an attack on something called Colonial Pipeline. I think it was about 2.5, 3 years ago now. But that attack was on a piece of infrastructure within the Colonial Pipeline that was the administrative or the information technology system, where accounts receivable, where kind of customer data, where deliveries to be made or deliveries that had been made for which there's a bill due, where all that was stored. It was not well defended by that company. A Russian criminal gang got into it. And because when the first responders showed up and they asked, is your information technology system attached to the motors and the pipes and the valves that kind of make the petroleum flow through Colonial Pipeline to your end customers? Because the company didn't really understand that architecture very well, the kind of decision was made to shut the whole thing down, which then became an attack on the confidence of millions of customers up and down the Eastern Seaboard. When you take that apart, part of it was, and I don't mean to ascribe kind of any kind of bad intentions to the company, but part of it was the complacency of thinking that they were safe, that they didn't have to actually worry about the inherent resilience or robustness. Part of it was the idea that the architecture, so long as it just it works day after day after day, doesn't need any particular kind of time and attention, kind of either to its own internal resilience or perhaps to the stout defense against those who would hold it at risk. And part of it was that the margins aren't there for that company to essentially take some of its profits, its revenue, and invest it back in the way a JP Morgan would. That's an historical kind of a reality, which is that probably that company grew up in a world where there was physical barriers between themselves and the outside world, fences, gates, guards. Pipelines had some physical integrity associated with them. And if you wanted to hold those at risk, you need to get physical access to those. Digital infrastructure makes it such that you can do that from a world away, right? You can manipulate, right, the pipeline valves a world away because the company built those digital controls in for purposes of efficiency, for purposes of perhaps enhancing the revenue, reducing the number of people that were required. And unless they built safety in at the same time, you find that you've actually now taken a risk that you've not covered down on. That exists broadly across many of our critical kind of sectors. I think there's now not just growing awareness, but universal awareness of that problem. But we have some tech deficit, meaning we've not built the controls in. We have some understanding or doctrinal deficit, and we don't have enough people to do the job. The answer isn't entirely going to be found in telling those various sectors, get your house in order. We need to provide them, to our earlier point, with the commodity software, hardware that actually has safety built in that they might then take advantage of as they build those systems out of those discrete parts. I'm going a little bit long on the question, but I think that the short answer is that it depends what sector you're talking about. It depends on their history. And in some cases, their history of dependence on digital infrastructure is sufficiently new and sufficiently kind of insidious, meaning they don't fully understand it, that they're in a different place than those that are really in a good place, like the financial sector.
No, that's interesting. It really goes back to this triad you presented earlier, right? Between innovation, market efficiency, and safety, especially in those industries that were more physical. And so they're getting market efficiency and innovation through some of the digital controls, but they don't necessarily understand the safety risk. We've also seen in other industries that are more digital by design, we have seen some pretty big cyber issues and response. I know, Uber, SolarWinds, there have been some major issues, and then actions by the SEC. Can you talk a little bit about that, going back to kind of the regulation conversation we had earlier, and do you see that the regulations we have in place now are going to deter some of these issues in the future?
I'll go back to the triad that I offered earlier, which was that in order to get the right mix of innovation, market efficiency, and safety, we have to first address the doctrine. We have to first to address the assignment of roles and responsibilities. Remember, that second triad that I offered was that the system that we're talking about, cyberspace, is actually comprised of not just technology, not just people, their decisions actually kind of implicate cyber futures, but doctrine. And let's take one of those examples that you mentioned kind of and pick it apart. SolarWinds. SolarWinds was a company within the United States operating out of Texas, so within the kind of jurisdiction of the United States, that built and sold software that I'll kind of give a rough characterization of this, that if you bought it, you would install it in your digital enterprise, and it would tell you something about what devices are installed, whether those devices had been recently patched, what's the provenance or the currency of the software on those. And so if you bought it, you could actually manage a very complicated enterprise and say, I understand all the devices that are in it, I understand what their provenance is, I understand what their current status is. And I must say that most of the customers that bought that software thought that it was security software, that what it was actually trying to guarantee was that you could run an enterprise whose provenance was understood and sustained and kind of well situated. However, the company, when the Russian government got into their software development environment and rode down through their distribution chain all the way to the end customers, the company itself, SolarWinds, when they testified before Congress not long after to say, how did they think about this and what explanation might they give about how they let this happen, said the most remarkable thing, which is that they wanted to be known in the future as a security company. Now, maybe they had thought of themselves in the past as a security company, but it seemed to me at the time as kind of this kind of promise or this declaration of what they intended to be in the future, but perhaps weren't in the past. That's a doctrinal problem because everybody in that supply chain thought that that was a security company, thought that that company would defend its software development environment against all comers, whether it's a criminal, whether it's a Russian government, and that even if they had failed in defending that software development environment against the incursion by the Russian government, which they didn't, that they would be able to detect it, that there'd be some way to actually understand that something got in before this flowed down the supply chain. And if you asked anybody in the supply chain or the end customers in that supply chain, where does security enter into this product? They would have said, well, at the factory. That's a doctrinal problem because there was a gross misalignment of the expectations. The Russian government in this case, which was behind the action, they didn't actually have to take advantage of some technology flaw. They didn't have to find a person who made a mistake on a given day, clicked on the wrong link. They walked right through the front door. They walked right through the doctrinal open front door, so that that was made easier for them. So my view is that you need to get the expectations about who's accountable for what right. You need to get that upfront. You then need to allocate those expectations so that everybody plays their role. Back to the car analogy. What do the car manufacturers do? What do the road builders do? What do the police forces who govern those road systems do? What do the end users do? That's a doctrinal kind of precept. So let's get that right in this system of systems. And we're beginning to do that, not just kind of within the United States, but broadly across the EU, which tends to lead on the allocation of expectations in this regard, and certainly in places like France. So we're beginning to do that. But given that so many of those institutions have not a long history of actually doing that kind of work, it's uneven, it's perhaps kind of halting and perhaps not proceeding as fast as we might like it to. This is not unlike climate change. I think let's presume everybody on this audience believes that climate change is a real thing. I do. If you want to go back and actually get to the dawn of that and say, how do I fix it? You probably have to go back 150 years. And if you want to turn it off now, if you want to make it go away right now, you can't. Right? If we were to stop the things that actually had made climate change what it is, the massive injection of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, if you stop that today, it still goes on. It gets probably worse for years to decades, because the inertia that we've allowed to actually progress here is something that we're dealing with as much or more as the kind of the activities that we have undertaken in the moment. Cyber is like that. Actually, cyber is slightly worse. It never had any resilience in it in the first place. And so we've got actually to deal with deficit in doctrine, deficit in expertise, and deficit in the technology that we built and deployed that probably goes back 40 years. So they're going to be compensating controls that we need to apply in the near term, a lot of which are going to be procedural in nature. What risks are you willing to take? Do you have backup kind of procedures in place? Do you have a backup data store if you're kind of subject to a ransomware attack, and so on and so forth? So that in the longer term, as resilience catches up, as a stout defense catches up, we can properly balance and align these things across the ecosystem.
So I want to build on the people piece of this with one of our audience questions. And I do want to get to audience questions now. So if anybody else has questions, please put them in. We have a few that came in ahead of time and one that's in there right now. So we have a VP in HR at an engineering company who's asking, she said she's curious about your insights regarding how to handle cybersecurity and AI with employees, especially younger generations, in terms of both technology and culture.
Well, that's a really good question. So I think that this, you've been thoughtful to ask about employees, which are the main bulwark of who's on the front lines of this. I also would kind of put this in the hands or put this question to the CEO or a board as well. I think I'd go back to what I'd said earlier, which is we have to begin with some understanding of why this matters. And I love, there's a fellow by the name of Jeff Moss, who actually is the person who started Black Hat and DEF CON for those that follow cyber closely. But if you haven't heard of those events, they're essentially conferences where the deep and sharp experts get together to talk about this. And when Jeff starts his talk, he almost always asks this question at the beginning. So why do race cars have bigger brakes? And for people who thought they were going to a cyber talk and are slightly confused at that moment, he immediately answers, race cars have bigger brakes so they can go faster. Right? He then lifts that question and kind of drops it into the cyber context and say, why do we have digital infrastructure? Not for its own sake. We don't have it so that we can have bragging rights about the quality of our digital infrastructure. We have it because the stuff that we care about depends on it, whether it's banking online, whether it's kind of reaching supply chains that I can't get to in a physical day using an airplane or a clipboard, whether it's kind of national security that might kind of be affected through the conduct of an election or perhaps diplomacy. All of that depends on digital infrastructure. So we need to make our line employees and our boards and our CEOs and everybody in between understand that first. We care about this because the things we already care about are dependent on it. And so let's think about those things that we already care about and why did digital infrastructure needs to play a role in that. If you establish that, and then you establish some expectations about what the person you're talking to's role is to kind of ensure that that confidence is well placed, then you're in a better place when you begin to ask them to engage in cybersecurity training or to take some certain actions with respect to the management of their passwords or the protection of their device. Because you're not asking them to defend the device. You're not asking them to defend a password, some arcane, some kind of esoteric issue in the corner. you're asking them to sustain something that they already care about. And I think a lot of companies don't go to the time and trouble to lay that out. Just, hey, look, what we're defending is the viability of the company, the viability of your job, the viability of our ability to say to our customers that we are defending your privacy, your integrity, kind of the sustainment of our ability to service your needs. That's what hangs in the balance. So if you establish that, and then you have kind of an application of what your expectations of that individual employee are, back to my regulation mantra, which is with the lightest possible touch, but no lighter. Don't have them doing things that are simply kind of security for its own sake, but security with a purpose. Then I think you have some reasonable expectation that they'll participate. I would say that a gradation in terms of what your responses are to the mistakes that they'll make is probably kind of in order. Let me take a case in point. One of the still very successful ways that attackers get into systems is they will send a line employee an email that will be very attractive. It might purport to come from the HR department, and it says, "Hey, do you know we're going to raise everybody's salary 10% in the next quarter? And if you want to know what your particular salary is, click on this link." That's an example. That is the most kind of unfortunate of combinations, because if it came from a criminal or an attacker, if it came from a criminal, it's code that they wrote. You have no idea what that code's about to do, right? It's their code, but it's going to operate with your authorities. That's a most unhappy combination. And so you need to make sure your line employees understand that, and then tell them that, look, you need to understand what the provenance of that email is. You're accountable to use your critical thinking powers to do that. So now let's say that they do click on that and something bad happens. First time, you might say, if that happens, we're going to kind of stand in and understand, what were you thinking? What were you doing? Probably it's a moment for advice and counsel. Second time, we're going to make a record in your personnel file, right? You'll go see your boss. It'll be an issue kind of when your performance appraisal is done at the end of that calendar year. Third time, you'll be kind of perhaps given a timeout, kind of 2 weeks off with or without pay, but you need to have some gradation so that, having given them an opportunity to understand it, having given them an opportunity to learn what they should do, you're now going to impose some expectation of consequence along a track of, if you fail to actually get it or do it, then there's going to be a consequence to that. You shouldn't lead with the consequence, because if they don't understand why and they don't understand how, then you're essentially going to be penalizing them in a way that's kind of negative. But that, I think, is the way to bring this to bear. In the same way that you teach people how to attend to the physical wherewithal of a workplace, or teach them how to use dangerous machinery, right? That there is an upfront part to get them to a place where they understand their role responsibility. They're trained in that. And they then are kind of expected to execute that with the benefits and the consequences that attend there too. I wish it was simpler and I could give you a one word or one phrase answer. Unfortunately, it's not, because humans are involved. And at the end of the day, we need to address the human component as much or more as the technical component.
Absolutely. And I would say the difference between dangerous machinery and some of these, say, phishing attacks, are that the dangerous machinery, I don't think, tries to be constantly recreated to look like safe machinery, right?
Well, that's true. That's true. That's true.
These phishing attacks get more and more sophisticated.
I teach at a U.S. Service Academy, actually two, and there's an interesting point that's made. It's like, we don't kind of give people guns who don't need them. And so students at these service academies, you don't give them guns, and then somebody will kind of like opine, but we give them keyboards, right? That are sometimes very dangerous, right? So what are we thinking? And so that's a bit of a cartoon.
So we have a question from one of our French colleagues. Any lessons on the Olympics and how to protect the Olympics for our French counterparts who are here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think you need to, and I think they're doing this well, to the degree I understand what our French counterparts are doing, I think that I would give them high marks for thinking their way through this. But you need to think about, what is the dependence of the Olympics on digital infrastructure, right? I'll kind of talk about cyber specifically. And there are probably several things that come immediately to mind. And I'll just discuss these perhaps in some kind of granular order. One is the coordination, synchronization of the various events depends upon the processing and the data that's stored in the digital infrastructure, the synchronization that anybody can look at and then follow the schedule online. That's important, right? The distribution of credentials, right, is kind of dependent upon digital infrastructure. The disposition or the distribution of tickets is dependent upon that. All of those things, think your way through and say, have I invested enough in the digital infrastructure such that I can have confidence that those systems will perform under the stress of an enormous volume of interest, under the stress of perhaps kind of outages that might occur in electrical systems, under the stress of weather systems, under the stress of attackers who might want to hold that at risk. Have I worked my way through all of that with some priority scheme? The NIST model that I talked about earlier, which I know that our French counterparts use faithfully and well, actually asks the right questions. Do I know what my dependence is? Have I protected that dependence? Can I identify something that gets in and holds that dependence at risk? Can I respond to that? Can I recover from that? So all of that is in play. But I would offer one thing more, which is that ultimately the thing that is often missed in these systems is that the most precious commodity that is kind of dependent upon these systems is confidence. Remember back to the kind of example I gave about Colonial Pipeline. When a Russian criminal gang got into the information technology system, that's the administrative side, there was concern that they might progress into the operational technology where the pipes and the valves lived. And because of that concern, the operators were told, and they did, shut the system down, which immediately then begat an attack on the confidence of millions of customers of, oh my goodness, petroleum products are no longer available to me. You know, the world has just ended. I need to rush the gas station and get all the gas I can. You don't want that failure of confidence in that system. You certainly don't want a failure of confidence in the Olympics, right? And so you need to make sure that you kind of stoutly defend the foundations of that digital infrastructure so that at any moment in time, people have confidence that their data is safe in that the information they get from it is actually kind of, it's got good provenance, that the synchronization, deployment, the execution of all of that can kind of play out so that not just the viability of the Olympics is intact, but the confidence that the French government or the French local authorities, kind of the confidence in them is sustained and maintained going forward. I think that they need to worry as much or more about the defense of that confidence. And how do you do that? You make sure you take care of the foundations. You make sure that you stoutly defend that. You make sure that you're able to respond and recover to that. And you perhaps tell some stories up front about the care and consideration you've given to that, so that when something kind of awkward or unfortunate happens, people say, well, I've heard you speak about that before. I now see you responding to that in the moment. I have every confidence in the world that you're competent to deal with this. You shouldn't be expected to define or to deliver a perfectly secure system. That's an unreasonable expectation, though there are some who have that. You should be expected to kind of deploy a defensible system that's then well defended, and that people will give you credit for that if they see your competence in the moment, not your perfection, but your competence in the moment. And then kind of being a part of a larger coalition always beats singular efforts. And the French, I think, have done that well in their Olympics.
Layered defense is important. So let's just end on one last question, given that this is a transatlantic conversation, that came in about the importance and coordination of collaborating across country boundaries. And how important is that and how hard is that in terms of sharing confidential information when you're dealing with different countries?
First, I think the question is right, which is that it is important. It's essential. The French, the Americans, and everybody else in between, we're not trying to solve similar problems. We're trying to solve the same problem. And we're not pursuing similar aspirations. We're pursuing exactly the same aspirations to ensure that our citizens have every confidence in the world that digital infrastructure will meet their needs, defend their information, kind of protect their privacy, allow them to engage in a free and open marketplace with every confidence in the world that they can focus on the positive aspects of that, not the negative aspects of that. Now, operating across boundaries, you sometimes have these either jurisdictional policy issues, or perhaps this kind of fear that if I share something with kind of some other side, that the information will be used in a way that's inappropriate for my side. My answer to that is that two things. One, you do need to take some time and consideration of how do you actually align or reconcile those disparate kind of policies. Tends to be that the European Union, as I indicated earlier, worries appropriately a lot about privacy, that nation states worry a lot about security, and that they both might be, those two might look like they're actually contending with one another, but a discussion up front about those are two unalloyed goods, we need to put the word and between them, can actually often find those mechanisms by which you can say, this is how we do both of those. That's, I think, necessary up front. But in the execution of that, I think that what I have seen is very successful is to not wait until something is so special, so kind of so important, so earth-shattering that you now have at the top of one of these stovepipes. Maybe it's the French national system, something that you think must be shared with the other side. And now you have the problem of how do I actually kind of sanitize this or take out the French special pieces of this or the United States special pieces of this and push it across this boundary between us. Share at the lowest possible level, kind of put people together who are actually trying to solve those common problems so that in the discovery of this information, which still hasn't been enriched, you can say, hey, this shard of an insight, this half of a hunch on one side or the other actually is part of the same problem that's afflicting both of us at the same time. If you share at the lowest possible level, if you put people together who actually have some comity in the moment of trying to defend systems of common interest, you find that collaboration becomes a lot easier. That's why intelligence organizations between the United States and France actually share richly, each respecting their kind of the rule of law within their respective nations, which are more alike than not, each responding to the highest common denominator about what that rule of law might kind of require, but share at the lowest possible level so that they can then kind of enrich that together as that moves up some stovepipe to the point where criticality would say we need to operate on this. If you kind of live in a silo at the moment that you're actually kind of trying to do something highly critical, highly prioritized, you'll find that the silo gets in the way. If you have a common kind of operational space where your people are collaborating kind of at all levels within that, you're in a much better place, which is why I love discussions like this, because I think what you have are people that have various and sundry distinct capabilities, but bringing them together before the event to say, how do we combine them before the event or in the event so that we're actually successful at the event.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly useful conversation, and we really appreciate it and hope that we will see you at our conference in December. So thank you so much.
D'accord.